Our second essay is going to be a compare and contrast essay. A compare and contrast essay basically focuses on the similarities and differences between two or more people, places, or things. Now, choosing your topic is very important. You have to choose something that has similarities and still have differences. Now, these similarities and differences should not be obvious. That's the main difference between a college paper and a high school paper. For instance, you may want to compare and contrast Duke versus Carolina, which is a fine topic. However, you don't want to have obvious points. So we all know that both these colleges are in North Carolina, and they are both associated with the color blue, just different forms of it. But you can do better than that. You want to kind of focus on one is private and one is public. And what are the differences between those two schools? Now you have a paragraph that has enough meat to fill up and be interesting and not have a bunch of obvious points that we already know. Here's another example, Pepsi versus Coke. We all have our favorite, but we don't want to talk about what tastes better because that's just a matter of opinion. Maybe you think Pepsi is sweeter, but I think Coke is sweeter. So that wouldn't be a good point. Instead, delve deeper and make a strong point. For instance, check out these marketing aspects of Coke and Pepsi. For instance, when you think of Coke, you may possibly think of polar bears and Christmas and family-oriented commercials. When you think of Pepsi, you may think of more celebrities or modern sort of marketing techniques. Now that would be a good paragraph. So you might ask, what kind of topic should you come up with? Well, you are going to compare and contrast two essays that you have already read in this course. Now, you're going to focus on thematic, which contains content, topics, what actually happens in the story, structural ideas, such as organization, how the author talks to the reader, sort of thing, and style, which is diction, voice, tone, those kind of elements. You are going to choose 2 out of the 4 texts. King Solver's Stone Soup, Rodriguez's Family Values, Mace's Being Country, and Walker's Everyday Use. You are only choosing 2. Once you choose your 2 texts, you're going to use MLA, have a works cited page, which is the last page. You're going to have 4 minimum pages. Don't go over 5. You're going to incorporate textual evidence, which we call quotes. And you're going to use compare and contrast strategies and basic composition skills, which is proper grammar. This is a Venn diagram and a good way to start brainstorming. After you have picked your topic and your stories and you come up with some points, you're ready to write your thesis statement. First, review your data, which is usually your Venn diagram. You're going to include your titles in quotation marks and your authors, the full names, in the thesis statement. You want to decide to what extent you're going to stress the similarities between your texts and to what extent you are going to stress your differences. In other words, you might have 2 similarities and maybe 1 difference. It doesn't really matter which order as long as you have 1 of each. Typically, you should have at least 3 points, but you may have 4. So create a thesis statement that reflects that decision and make it very clear to the reader. Here are some examples of weak thesis statements. The 2 essays are both somewhat alike and somewhat different. Both of the essays involve family, a negative tone, and abandonment. Both of these essays do not include the essay's names, and they do not include the author's names. They are also not telling me contrasting ideas and comparing ideas. They're just doing one. Here's a slightly better thesis statement. While the Toyota Corolla and the Honda Civic are both quality and best-selling automobiles, the 2 cars differ in starting price, the average mileage, and the standard features. Now in this example, I am telling the reader that I'm about to tell them one similarity, which is that they're both best-selling automobiles, and 3 differences: a starting price, an average mileage, and a standard features. Here's another example of a thesis statement, and this time I used literature. So in The Lord of the Flies by William Golding, Ralph and Jack have very different leadership styles, attitudes, and motivations, which both lead to the eventual chaos and anarchy on the island. So in this statement, I have the text, the author. I'm discussing the differences and similarities between 2 characters, even though you in your paper will be doing 2 different essays. But I stress the differences and the similarities separately. Okay. For instance, they have different leadership styles. That will be a body paragraph. They have different attitudes, and they have different motivations. Then they also have similar chaos and anarchy on the island. You will be using point-by-point organization in this essay, meaning that each body paragraph is going to prove a point. You're going to talk about your first story, and then you're going to use a transition and talk about your second story in the same paragraph. Here's another way to look at point by point. Notice that you still have a hook like your last paper. You're still going to transition into that thesis, which will be the last sentence and 1 sentence. And then you're going to have your points. So in this instance where we're doing Toyota and Honda, you'll have price will be the point. You'll talk about Toyota and Honda. Then mileage, Toyota, and then Honda. The order does matter. So if you start with Toyota, you will always start with Toyota. Here are some common compare and contrasting transitions that you might want to use in your essay. There are more examples of transitions in your LB brief. This is an example of what a works cited page can look like. However, your works cited page will only have 2 citations in it because you're only going to be citing 2 stories. This one has 5. Although a lot more information can be found in your LB brief, a works cited page is always the last page of the essay and on its own separate sheet of paper. It should say works cited with an S as your title. Do not bold or underline that title. Your article should be in alphabetical order by the first word listed in the citation, which is normally the author's last name. You will be citing the articles you use from your textbook, and you're going to use MLA. Again, you'll be using in-text citations, which can also be called parenthetical citations in your essay. You're going to have 2 quotes per body paragraph.